Hi everyone, my name is Meghan Troup and I'll be talking to you today about mapping eelgrass in Cole Harbour using a remotely operated hovercraft. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction on the SWASH system. The SWASH system stands for Shallow Water Autonomous Surveying Hovercraft, and it's comprised of the hovercraft vehicle, the electronics on board, and a sonar arm, which includes a single beam sonar and a side scan sonar. Hovercrafts are considered air cushion vehicles because they fly on top of a thin layer of air between the vehicle and the surface. The layer is formed when air is forced through the duct by the propellers and into the skirt, and small holes in the skirt allow for air to escape slowly, forming this very thin cushion of air that the hovercraft flies upon. Now, it took us about 3 years to get this hovercraft fully operational and to work autonomously. And at that point, we really wanted to look for places that we could survey and case studies that we could complete. And we settled on mapping eelgrass in Nova Scotia. So eelgrass is the dominant seagrass species in the Northern Hemisphere. It's threatened by eelgrass wasting disease, invasive species, and anthropogenic eutrophication. Habitat maps of this species are typically made using satellite imagery, underwater video, imaging sonar, visual observation, or a combination of these techniques. And one thing I wanted to point out specifically for Nova Scotia is that maps are often made infrequently and are not in detail. So for example, I've included a map from McCullough et al. In 2005. This map was made using data from 2002 when we know that there was an eelgrass decline. But in all of these maps, eelgrass is shown as being existing throughout many bays or inlets. So for example, in this map, eelgrass is shown with red vertical lines all the way throughout Cole Harbour, but we know that that's not actually the case, that there's actually just small distinct eelgrass beds all over the place. So we're specifically looking at mapping this eelgrass bed shown on the map below. It sits between Saltmarsh Trail and Cow Bay Road. The blue star on this map is where we actually set up our base station. It had to be kind of close to the eelgrass bed because we needed a small distance between us and the hovercraft to be able to talk to the electronics on board. So the validation for this project was done using a combination of satellite imagery and photography and underwater video using a 1x1 meter quadrat. So I'm going to go through our preliminary results of seafloor segmentation. Seafloor segmentation was performed by taking statistics of single beam echo sounder profiles and running them through a clustering algorithm. Clustering algorithms take like statistics from the echo sounder profiles and separate them into distinct groups. So in plot A, you can see we have 3 distinct groups: a thick vegetation, a sparse vegetation, and a bare sediment. Now we can compare this to the validation results, which is shown in plot B. The larger circles indicate a larger percent cover, which indicates thicker vegetation. And as you can see, there are a group of larger circles where we expect to see this thick vegetation from the results of the clustering algorithm. Now, I do want to point out that there's also thick vegetation below that in the validation results. And the only reason it doesn't show up in the clustering algorithm results is because the hovercraft was actually run a little bit further offshore than the validation data. And we just didn't have enough validation data to match up to where the hovercraft was at that time. So you can see that there's only sparse vegetation where closer to shore, compared to the validation data, there is thicker vegetation. Now we can also compare this to the side scan data. Now side scan is an imaging sonar, so it basically uses sound to take a picture of the sea floor. And what we're seeing here, this bright white, this bright orange color, that means that the data is oversaturated, that the backscatter is too high for the sonar to comprehend. And that's because we completed this survey at low tide, and the seagrass was actually brushing right up against the sonar transducers. So we're seeing an oversaturation there, which indicates thick vegetation. The seagrass was literally brushing up against the sonar on both sides. And on either side of that, to the northwest and to the southeast, we can see little speckles, which does indicate that there is vegetation there as well, but it might be either shorter or there's less of it, so it might be sparser. So my next steps for this project are to compare surveys that were completed this past summer and in 2019. So we can compare consecutive surveys for dynamics over a growing season, and then we can compare surveys taken in different years to determine annual variability of the seagrass in Cole Harbour. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I'm really looking forward to answering your questions.